The signs on the Danube. There is a small clay disc, a little under 6 centimeters across, that sits in a museum in the Transylvanian city of Cluj in the north of Romania. It is not much to look at. It is the color of old bone, roughly circular, with a hole bored near one edge as if it were once meant to hang from a cord. Across its face, someone has pressed a scatter of marks. A few short strokes. Something that looks like a comb, or a rake, or a little ladder lying on its side. A shape that could be an animal, or could be nothing, divided from the rest by 2 lines that cross the disc into quarters. The marks were made in soft clay by a hand that has been dust for more than 7,000 years. And to this day, no one on Earth can tell you, with any certainty, whether they mean anything at all. This little disc, and 2 rectangular tablets found beside it, have a name. They are called the Tartaria tablets, after the village near where they were dug from the ground. They are among the most quietly disruptive objects in the whole study of the human past, because they sit exactly on a fault line, a place where 2 enormous ideas grind against each other. One idea says that writing, the greatest of all human inventions, was born once, in the mud of southern Iraq, among a people called the Sumerians, and spread outward from there like light from a single lamp. The other idea says that the little disc in Cluj is older than the Sumerians, older than their first written word by the better part of 2,000 years, and that if it is writing, then everything we thought we knew about where writing comes from is wrong. Tonight I want to walk with you slowly through that quarrel, not to settle it, because it has never been settled, but because it is one of the most beautiful unresolved arguments we have, and because the story of how anyone came to have the argument at all is a long and gentle rabbit hole, exactly the kind of thing to sink into as you drift toward sleep. Let us begin with the finding, because the finding is where all the trouble starts. In the year 1961, an archaeologist named Nicolae Vlasa was excavating a low mound near the village of Tartaria, in the valley of the Murs River, in the middle of Transylvania. A mound like this is called a tell, and it is not a natural hill. It is a hill made of time. It is what you get when people live in the same place for century after century, building their houses of mud and timber, watching those houses fall, and building again on top of the ruins, so that the ground slowly rises beneath the village like bread. Dig down through a tell, and you dig down through the years, layer by patient layer, deeper and older the further you go. Vlasa was digging near the bottom, in the layers left by a people we call the Vinca culture, farmers and potters who lived across the Danube basin in the 6th millennium before the Common Era, which is to say more than 7,000 years ago. And down in one of those deep layers, Vlasa came upon a pit. Inside the pit was a strange and solemn arrangement. There were around 24 small figurines of clay and stone, the kind of little idols that Neolithic people made in great numbers, many of them shaped like women. There was a bracelet made from a spondylus shell, a spiny oyster from the distant Aegean Sea, which means it had traveled a very long way to end up in a Transylvanian grave. And there were human bones. They were the bones of an adult, and they were burnt and broken and scattered, disarticulated, which is the archaeologist's word for a skeleton that is no longer arranged as a body, but tumbled into pieces. Later writers, reaching for something more vivid than bones in a pit, would call this person the Lady of Tartaria or Milady Tartaria, and would imagine her as a priestess, a wise woman, a shaman, someone important enough to be buried with idols and shell, and above all, with the 3 inscribed tablets that lay among her remains. Those tablets are the reason we are here. 2 of them are rectangular, one is the round disc I described. 2 of the 3 have holes drilled through them. On one of the rectangular tablets there is a picture, a little scene, containing what looks like a horned animal, perhaps a goat, along with a shape that no one can quite name and a branching form that could be a tree or a stalk of grain. The other 2 tablets carry not pictures but signs, abstract marks arranged in rows and quadrants, And it was these signs that made Vlasa's heart beat faster, because to his eye, they looked uncannily like the very earliest writing of ancient Sumer. Now, to understand why that resemblance was so electric and so troubling, you have to understand the world of ideas that Vlasa lived inside. For most of the history of archaeology, scholars believed in a picture of the past that had a beautiful and simple shape. They believed that the great inventions of civilization, agriculture, cities, metalworking, monumental building, and writing above all, had each been invented once, in the ancient Near East, in that band of fertile land curving from Egypt up through the Levant and down into Mesopotamia. From that cradle, the story went, the light of civilization spread outward to the more backward peoples on the edges, to Europe and beyond, arriving later and weaker the farther it traveled. There was even a Latin motto for this belief, elegant and confident: Ex Orient Lux, light from the East. Under this picture, everything in prehistoric Europe was younger than its counterpart in the Near East, because Europe was the pupil and the Near East was the teacher. Europe did not invent. Europe received. So when Vlasa looked at his tablets and saw signs that resembled archaic Sumerian, the story wrote itself at first. The Sumerians had invented writing, somewhere around 3,200 years before the Common Era, on the plains of southern Iraq. Somehow, an echo of that invention, a rumor of it, had drifted north and west across the mountains and reached the Danube. Some Transylvanian, dimly aware that in far-off lands people made meaningful marks on clay, had imitated the practice without understanding it, pressing sign-like shapes into these little tablets. The tablets were younger than Sumer, obviously, because everything in Europe was younger than the Near East. That was simply the shape of the world. The resemblance was the proof of the copying, and the copying was the proof of the direction, from east to west, from teacher to pupil, from light to shadow. And then the whole shape of the world turned over. What turned it over was not a new tablet or a new tomb. It was a new clock. In the middle of the 20th century, a chemist named Willard Libby had worked out that living things absorb a faint, steady trickle of a radioactive form of carbon, carbon-14, from the atmosphere, and that when a living thing dies, that trickle stops, and the radioactive carbon already inside it begins to decay away at a fixed and known rate. Measure how much is left, do the arithmetic of the decay, and you can read, from a scrap of charcoal or bone or grain, roughly how long ago the thing was alive. This was radiocarbon dating, and it was a miracle, because for the first time in history, it let archaeologists put a number of years on their finds directly, without having to chain them link by link back to some king list in Egypt or Mesopotamia. It won Libby a Nobel Prize, and it changed everything. But it had a hidden flaw, and the discovery of that flaw is the second great turning of our story. The flaw was this: radiocarbon dating quietly assumed that the amount of radioactive carbon in the atmosphere had always been the same, steady across all of history. But it had not been. It had wobbled, drifting up and down over the millennia as the sun and the Earth's magnetic fields slowly changed. Which meant that the raw radiocarbon dates were subtly, systematically wrong, and, crucially, wrong by more and more the further back in time you went. To fix this, scientists needed some independent record of the true age of things, a second clock to check the first against. And they found one in the most patient of all natural archives, the growth rings of trees. Every year a tree lays down a ring, a thick one in a good year, a thin one in a lean year, so that the sequence of rings makes a kind of barcode, a pattern of fat and thin years unique to its stretch of time. By matching the ring patterns of living trees to the patterns in old timbers, and those to still older beams and buried logs, dendrochronologists built a continuous, year-by-year calendar of tree rings reaching back thousands of years, each ring an unarguable single year. And then they took wood of known ring age and measured its radiocarbon, and so drew up a correction table, a way to translate the lying radiocarbon numbers into true calendar years. This is called calibration, and when the calibration curve was worked out, it revealed that everything before about the third millennium was older than the raw radiocarbon dates had said. The deep past was deeper than anyone had believed, and that single correction detonated the tidy old picture of history. The person who told this story most powerfully was a British archaeologist named Colin Renfrew, in a book published in 1973 with a title that says it all. Before Civilization, subtitled The Radiocarbon Revolution and Prehistoric Europe. Renfrew showed, patiently and devastatingly, that once you applied the tree ring correction, the whole diffusionist scheme fell apart. The great stone monuments of Western Europe, the megalithic tombs of Brittany and the Atlantic coast, turned out to be older than the Eastern Mediterranean tombs they were supposed to have been copied from. The temples of Malta were older than the pyramids, and the cultures of the Danube, the world of Vinci, the world of those little tablets, stretched back not to some modest date safely after Sumer, but to 5,500 years before the Common Era, deep in the 6th millennium, more than 2,000 years before the Sumerians pressed their first sign into clay. The pupil, it turned out, was older than the teacher. The light had not come only from the east, and the whole comfortable assumption that let Vlasser read his tablets as a copy of Sumer, quietly, without even needing to argue for it, collapsed. Because you cannot copy something that will not exist for another 2,000 years. If the Tartaria signs really were made when the layer around them said they were made, then the resemblance to Sumerian writing could not be imitation. It had to be something else. Either a coincidence, two peoples independently reaching for similar simple shapes, or, if you were bold enough to say it, evidence that the idea of writing had been reached, or nearly reached, on the banks of the Danube first. You can perhaps feel the vertigo of this. It is the vertigo of having the arrow of causation, which pointed so firmly from east to west, suddenly waver and threaten to reverse. And into that vertigo poured a great flood of claims, some careful and some wild, that the Danube Valley was the true home of the oldest writing in the world, that European civilization had a script 15 centuries before Sumer, that history, as taught in the schoolbooks, had the whole story backward. The signs even acquired grand new names. The great Lithuanian-American archaeologist Marija Gimbutas, who saw in Old Europe a peaceful, goddess-worshipping civilization later overrun by warlike horsemen from the steppe, called the marks the Old European script. Others called it the Danube script. To speak those names is already to take a side, because a script is a way of writing, and whether these marks are writing is precisely the thing that has never been agreed. So let us slow down and be as fair as we can to the doubters, because the doubters have very good points, and the pleasure of a puzzle like this lies as much in the objections as in the claims. The first and heaviest objection is about the tablets themselves and how they were found. Vlasser, for all that he made the discovery, never wrote a clear account of the exact stratigraphy, the precise layer-by-layer position in which the tablets lay. And that silence is a wound in the evidence that has never healed. Skeptics have long suspected that the tablets did not truly belong to the deep Vinci layer at all, but had slipped down from some higher, younger level, or been dug into the old layer from above, so that they only appeared to be 7,000 years old while really being much younger. A pit, remember, is a hole, and a hole is dug down from some surface, which means the things in a pit can be a great deal younger than the earth the pit cuts through. If the Lady of Tartaria was buried into the old settlement long after it was abandoned, then her tablets tell us nothing about the 6th millennium at all. The second objection is a small tragedy of good intentions. When the tablets came out of the ground, they were made of unfired clay, soft and crumbling and desperately fragile. And so, to save them, museum workers did the sensible, careful, preserving thing. They baked them hard, as one might fire a pot. In doing so, they made the tablets durable enough to survive to today. And at the very same stroke, they destroyed forever the possibility of dating the tablets themselves by radiocarbon. Firing floods the clay with modern carbon from the fuel in the air and resets the clock to nonsense. So the one direct question we would most love to ask the tablets, how old are you, truly, in your own substance, can never now be answered. The kindness that saved them also silenced them. And the third objection came early and came hard, from a British archaeologist named Sinclair Hood, who in 1967 published a paper in the journal Antiquity simply titled The Tartaria Tablets. Hood looked at the same resemblance to Near Eastern writing that had so struck Vlasa, and he drew the opposite conclusion. The resemblance is real, he argued, and it is not a coincidence, and it is not European priority. It is exactly what it looks like, imitation. Hood proposed that the tablets were genuinely much younger than the layer suggested, that they were made by someone who had encountered real writing from the literate civilizations to the southeast, from the Aegean or the Near East, and who had copied its outward look without grasping its meaning. The way you or I might scrawl marks in imitation of a language we cannot read, producing something that has the shape of writing but none of its substance. On this view, the lady's scribe was a kind of dilettante, an imitator, and the tablets are a forgery not in the sense of a fraud, but in the sense of a costume, writing-shaped objects that were never meant to be read. Here is the elegant, maddening thing about the whole controversy, the hinge on which it turns. The very same fact, the resemblance between the Danube signs and early Near Eastern writing, points in opposite directions depending on which clock you trust. If you trust the old chronology, the resemblance proves that the Danube copied the Near East, light from the east, as everyone always knew. If you trust the radiocarbon chronology, the resemblance cannot be copying at all, and must be either coincidence or something stranger. The same clue, read forward or backward in time, tells two completely contradictory stories. And which story is true depends entirely on a question about a pit and a layer of soil that Vlasa never properly recorded, and that we can now never fully reconstruct. Let us step back from the three little tablets, though, because they are really only the most dramatic exhibit in a much larger and calmer body of evidence, and it is in that larger body that the deepest questions lie. The Tartaria tablets do not stand alone. They belong to a vast scatter of marked objects across the whole Danube world, thousands of them, and it is worth sitting for a while with the sheer, quiet abundance of these signs, because the abundance is the real mystery, far more than any single sensational find. Across the lands of old Europe, across what is now Serbia and Romania and Bulgaria and Hungary, and beyond, the people of the Vinci culture and their neighbors spent 2,000 years, from roughly 5,400 to 4,500 before the Common Era, pressing and scratching little signs into their things. An American scholar named Shan Win made the first great catalog of these marks, and counted something like 210 distinct sign types, built up out of a small set of simple elements. Straight lines, dots, crosses, chevrons, the letter V, spirals, zigzags, the meander, little combs and ladders and brackets. He gathered these from over 1,000 inscribed objects, from more than 150 different sites, amounting to some thousands of individual sign impressions in all. And here is the first strange thing about them. They appear, overwhelmingly, not on grand monuments or official documents, but on the humblest household stuff. They appear on the bottoms of pots. They appear on the little clay weights called spindle whorls that women slipped onto a stick to spin thread. They appear on figurines, on loom weights, on the small clay objects of ordinary Neolithic life. And here is the second strange thing, the thing that breaks the heart of anyone who wants these to be writing. The signs almost never come in long strings. In the great majority of cases, more than 8 in every 10, a marked object bears just a single sign, standing alone. Now and then you find 2 or 3 together, and very rarely a little cluster, And the very longest sequences, on objects like the Tartaria tablets, reach perhaps 2 or 3 dozen signs. But there is nothing that looks like a sentence, nothing that flows on and on the way real writing flows. There are no long texts. And that absence is the great wall against which every attempt to prove these signs our writing has broken. Because think about what writing, full writing, actually is. Full writing is a system for recording language, spoken language, sound by sound or word by word, closely enough that a reader can recover an utterance the writer never spoke aloud to them, can hear, in the silence of their own head, a specific sentence in a specific tongue conjured by marks on a surface. Writing in that strong sense is bound to speech. It is a machine for turning the flow of a language into visible, durable marks and back again. The Sumerians had that. Their tablets record loaves of bread and heads of cattle, and the names of officials, in the Sumerian language, in strings and columns that go on because language goes on, and we can read them because they are language made visible. The Vinci signs show almost none of that. They do not run on. They do not seem to spell. They do not, as far as anyone has been able to demonstrate in more than a century of trying, encode the sounds or the words of any spoken language. And scholars have tried, in every way they can think of. They have tried to match the signs to later alphabets. They have run the signs through computers, measuring their statistics, their frequencies, the way one sign follows another, hunting for the mathematical fingerprint that distinguishes a true writing system from a mere collection of symbols. But the corpus is too small and too full of lonely single signs to give a clear answer. There is simply not enough there, not enough flow, not enough sequence, to prove that a language is hiding underneath. The signs keep their silence. This is where Colin Renfrew, the same scholar who overturned the old chronology and made the Danube signs impossibly ancient, plants his careful and characteristic doubt. To call these Balkan signs writing, he wrote, is perhaps to imply that they had an independent significance of their own, communicable to another person without oral contact. And this, he said plainly, I doubt. It is a subtle sentence, and worth turning over slowly in the dark. What Renfrew is asking is whether these marks could carry a message across a gap, from one mind to another, without anyone speaking. Could a stranger, coming upon a marked pot, read from the sign alone something its maker meant, the way you can read a note left on a table by someone long gone from the room? Or did the sign only mean something to someone who already knew, by word of mouth, what it was for, so that the mark was less a message than a reminder, a token, a private knot tied in a handkerchief that says nothing at all to anyone who is not told? That distinction has a name, or rather a pair of names, and they are worth carrying with you, because they turn out to be the real heart of the whole matter. On one side, there is what scholars call glottography, writing in the full sense, marks bound to a specific spoken language, marks that spell. On the other side, there is semasiography, a system of meaning signs that convey ideas or categories directly, without passing through the sounds of any particular tongue. The numerals we use are a little like semasiography. The sign for 5 means the same idea to a French reader and a Turkish reader and a Japanese reader, who all pronounce it with completely different words. A skull on a bottle, a heart on a card, an arrow on a wall. These are meaning signs that speak straight to the mind without spelling out a word. And it may be, many careful scholars now think it likely, that the Vinci signs were something like this. Not a failed or embryonic version of Sumerian writing, not writing that never grew up, but a different kind of thing altogether. A rich and structured system of symbols that marked ownership, or lineage, or the contents of a pot, or the dedication of an offering, or the presence of a god, and that never needed to record language because that was never what it was for. There is a name that keeps surfacing in the Vinci material, by the way, a marking that appears again and again, and it is tempting to dwell on it because it hints at what these signs may have carried. Many of the inscribed objects seem tied to ritual, to the little household shrines and the countless female figurines, so that a good number of scholars suspect the signs are bound up with the sacred, with worship and offering and the marking of holy things, rather than with trade or accounting, which is where Sumerian writing began. If that is right, then the Danube signs and the Sumerian signs were not even trying to do the same job. Sumer wrote to count barley and tax the living. The Danube, perhaps, marked to speak with the dead and the divine. Two peoples, 2,000 years and 1,000 miles apart, reaching for marks on clay for reasons so different that it is almost meaningless to ask which of them invented writing first, because they may not have been inventing the same thing at all. And that thought carries us back, at the last, to the Lady of Tartaria, to the burnt and broken bones in the pit, because in recent decades, a scholar named Marco Merlini went back to those very bones and did the thing that the baked tablets would never allow. He had the human remains themselves radiocarbon dated. Bone, unlike the fired tablets, still carries an honest clock. And the bones of the Lady of Tartaria return to date deep in the 6th millennium, calibrated to somewhere around 5,300 to 5,100 years before the Common Era, 7,000 years ago and more, squarely in the ancient Vincia world and squarely, impossibly, long before Sumer. Merlini argued that the tablets belonged with her, that they were laid in her grave as part of whatever rites sent her into the earth, and that the perforated tablets, the ones with holes, may have been worn, strung on a cord around the neck of a living person before they were buried with the dead. Less a document than an amulet, a thing held close to the body, warm with meaning. Of course, the old objection has not gone away, and honest scholars will tell you it cannot be made to go away. Dating the woman is not quite the same as dating the tablets, because a grave is still a hole dug down from some surface, and the deepest doubt about Tartaria can never be entirely closed. But something in Merlini's work shifts the feeling of the whole story, and I want to leave you with that shift, because it is a gentle place to rest. For decades, the argument about Tartaria was an argument about chronology and diffusion and the direction of the arrow of history, about whether Europe or the Near East got there first. A contest, a race, with a winner and a loser, and a prize called the oldest writing in the world. And races are the wrong frame for falling asleep, and it turns out, very probably the wrong frame for the past as well. Because the more you sit with these signs, the less they look like an entry in a race, and the more they look like something quieter and stranger, and more human. Here was a people, along a green river valley, 7,000 years ago, who for 2,000 years, far longer than the entire span from ancient Rome to now, kept a system of signs. They taught it to their children. They pressed it into the clay of their pots and the weights of their spindles and the idols of their gods. From the Aegean edge of the Balkans up to the plains of Hungary, the same signs, recognizable across all that distance, which means the system was learned and shared and held in common by people who never met. They carried it, some of them, on cords around their necks. And then, around 4,500 before the Common Era, as the Vincia world dissolved and its great settlements were left to the grass, the signs faded out. The people stopped making them. And because the signs were never quite writing, never bound tightly enough to any spoken language for the language to be recovered, when the last person who knew what they meant lay down and died, the meaning went out of the world like a candle, and it did not leave a copy of itself behind. So we are left holding a small clay disc, a little under 6 centimeters across, with a hole bored near its edge, covered in marks that were made with care, that meant something, surely, to someone, that were worth carrying and worth burying, and that will very likely never be read again by anyone ever. And perhaps the deepest thing the Tartaria tablets have to teach is not about Sumer at all, and not about who was first. Perhaps it is simply that the reaching toward writing, the human impulse to fix a meaning outside the fragile vault of memory and set it down in something that will outlast the voice, was not a single lightning strike in a single valley that then spread to a waiting world. Perhaps it happened more than once, and in more than one shape, and reached different distances in different places, sometimes flowering into the full machinery of recorded language, and sometimes stopping just short of it, or turning to the side of it, into signs that spoke to the gods but not to us. Perhaps literacy is less a discovery than a tide that has come in and gone out on many shores, and left, here and there along the beach of history, these small marked stones, still holding their meaning tightly, patiently, silently, refusing after 7,000 years to tell us what they know. And there is no need tonight to make them tell. The signs have kept their secret this long, and they will keep it a while longer, resting in their museum drawer in the quiet city of Cluj, in the Valley of the Muirs, under the same slow stars that turned above the Lady of Tartaria when she was laid in the earth with her idols and her shell bracelet and her 3 small tablets, 7,000 years ago when the marks were new. And someone who loved her, or feared her, or honored her, pressed them into the soft clay and believed, with all their heart, that they would be understood.